So thank you everyone for joining us today. If you just got in, my name is James Bassal. I'm a graduate assistant for the Alda Center here, and I'll be introducing Doctors Besley and Dudo. They're kind enough to join us here today to give a presentation that we're very excited to see. Just a heads up, I just saw someone ask recently if there's going to be a recording available. Yes, there will be a recording available within a few weeks. And so we'll be sharing information about that once it comes up. So if that is a concern, don't worry about that. So some brief information. Doctors Dudo and Besley have focused their recent research on how to improve the quality of science communication practice. As part of their work, they've developed a framework for strategic science communication that emphasizes the initial importance of setting clear communication, that emphasizes the initial importance, emphasize the initial importance of setting clear objectives that have the potential of affecting desired behaviors, as well as tactics that have the potential of helping achieve communication objectives. So we're really excited to see them here today. Doctors Anthony Dudo and John Besley, you can feel free to take them here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us, and thank you everyone for joining us. We have some slides we're going to go through in about 30-40 minutes, which should give us plenty of time for some discussion at the end. And so Anthony and I are going to sort of team do this. So we're going to take the slides as they come. And the background's orange, it means Anthony's going to do it. If the background's green, it means I'm going to do it. But we'll sort of work through it, and hopefully there'll be plenty of time for discussion. And I also noticed that there's also some Q&A sort of features built into the Zoom hardware or Zoom software if you want to do it that way too. So first, I want to start off by saying, so yeah, Anthony and I have been fortunate to now, for the last probably 6 years, to be spending a lot of time doing surveys of scientists and lots of different things. But I want to start with our goal. So our goal in all our research is we want, and this is very important in the sense that we're going to differentiate between goals and objectives and tactics in a second. But for us, the goal bit is it's a behavior. So we would like people to turn to scientists as the smart friend they rely upon when they're faced with difficult questions. We want people to turn to scientists. That's what all our research is about. We're trying to, in sort of a broader context. But to get to that, there's a lot of bits that go into that. And so that's what we're going to talk about and share with you today, how our thinking about that is right now, but also a little bit how it's evolved and where we think we're going.
And before we really dive into the details, I'll just give a little bit more context about who we are and where we're coming from. Before John and I went back to grad school to get PhDs and do research on science communication, we both worked as strategic communicators. John was up in Canada working for an environmental organization and with the government, and I was at a science museum in Philadelphia doing marketing communication for them. And so a lot of the research questions that sit underneath John and I, all of our scholarship and our work, are things that kind of germinated and came up when we were actual practitioners doing science communication. And this is all to say that a lot of what we do in our neck of the woods in academia is very much ideally connected back to real questions about science communication. And for us, that's why we've been really excited to spend a lot of time in this space doing the type of research that we've been doing. And we've done a lot of different types of research, and John and I have been working together for about, as he mentioned, about 6 years together, and we had been probably both working in this space at least 15, maybe 15, 20 years or so. We've done a lot of research on public views about science and scientists, so survey research and things like that. And lately we've done a lot, most of our research has been focused on the scientific community itself and on the stakeholders and key folks who are really active in trying to help the scientific community learn how to become more frequent and more effective communicators and engagers. We've done a lot of surveys with scientists. At this point, we've probably surveyed at least 15,000 scientists in the last 5 years or so. And we've also been doing a lot of in-depth qualitative interview work with different key stakeholders in the science communication ecosystem, and greatly enjoying that as well. Just to kind of highlight that, some of a program of research within that has been focused on the science communication training community. We've been really lucky to have an opportunity to have in-depth conversations with this community back in 2014 and most recently in 2017. The first time is from an NSF grant, and the second time a number of foundations were contributing to that. To sit down and get a better understanding of what things look like within the science communication training landscape, if you will. Who's doing it? What do their curricula look like? What are they trying to accomplish? What are their experiences with the different scientists they train look like? Do we see any kind of consistency across the different training organizations? Do we see any differences? And most importantly, what are some kind of key opportunities for growth, scale, and even improvement within the training community itself? And so we've had really great conversations with what is a really unique group, a really unique and energetic group of people we found. And this is just this slide just shows some highlights of our most recent interview project with this particular community. And certainly there's a lot of other stuff that we found in this work, but these are some of the key kind of takeaway messages that popped out in this. So first off, across a lot of the training the science training communication organizations, that there's a lot of focus on what we refer to as tactics, on how to translate your research, get rid of jargon, give an elevator pitch, put together a PowerPoint deck, use dialogue, tell stories, etc. And that's great, but we're gonna argue that there's a little bit more to the story, arguably here. We're interested in talking to a lot of the folks in the space about the extent to which they use social scientific research and find it valuable. At this point, we found, with a couple of exceptions, but for the large part, that social science is not integrated or baked into the curricula or into the head and hearts of a lot of the folks doing the training. There are exceptions to that. And we're going to explore that a little bit more later as well. Right now, one thing that was really striking from this community is that they feel incredibly isolated and not really familiar with other folks who are in the space doing this work. And they desperately, and almost to a person that we interviewed, wanted to have an opportunity to have more interactions with one another and form a community so that they could share best practices. We also talked about evaluation. So we were interested in the trainers telling us a little bit about the extent to which how they know that the training they're providing is actually working, and for, when is it working and for whom is it working. Not surprisingly, for a number of really legitimate logistical reasons, there's not a lot of evaluation efforts, certainly longitudinal evaluation efforts or multi-method evaluation efforts that are out there. And there's been a lot of activity in that space in the last year or so, for sure. But trainers were quick to point out that when it comes to evaluation, it tends not to be their priority. And the last thing that we want to highlight here is we were really interested in getting a sense of, within their kind of curricula, the extent to which they were focused on what John and I refer to as kind of communication strategy. And for the most part, communication strategy was not integrally baked into these curricula. There was very much a focus, again, on the tactics for communication, but there wasn't a lot of focus on understanding or setting a behavioral goal for the scientists' communication efforts, thinking about what types of objectives would make it more or less likely for the scientists to achieve that goal, and then pairing those objectives up with certain tactics that are a good match. And we're going to walk through that a little bit today with you, but this is a recent piece of work that we've done that has greatly informed what we're going to talk about now.
Absolutely. And so we're going to get to the next slide here. So this is a big slide. We're going to keep coming back to this slide over the course of the next 20 or 30 minutes. It's everything, but so we're gonna keep coming back to this. But this is what we're getting to. This is our overall framework, and it takes this idea of communication tactics, objectives, goals. We're gonna talk about goals first, then we're gonna talk about tactics, and then we're gonna spend most of our time talking about what we think of about objectives, because we really think that that's where the heart of really good strategic evidence-based communication comes from being really knowledgeable and thoughtful about that middle bit. What are your communication objectives you want to achieve? So let's start by talking about goals. Anthony?
Unmute myself there. So what do we mean by goals? And another way of thinking about this is for a scientist who's going to go out there, who's going to get engaged, who's going to communicate, what is he or she, hoping is going to actually happen from that effort, from the time, the money, the energy that they're going to put into that effort? What do they want to eventually have happen? What we found in a lot of our conversations with qualitative conversations with stakeholders, and actually in some of our survey research with scientists as well, that the answer tends to be on this question, we really, we want to inform, we want to spark dialogue, we want to, increase understanding, we want to increase interest in science. And of course that's perfectly natural, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think our argument here a little bit, as represented by the image that we have on the slide, is that's part of the picture, but ultimately that we're leaving out that final endpoint. And our argument would you be happy if you only informed someone? Would you be happy if you only boosted interest? Would you be happy if you only sparked dialogue? Or are those things ultimately in service to changing some sort of behavior with the person with whom you're engaging, some sort of perception with the person with whom you're engaging? And so that's much more what we mean when we talk about goals.
And really, when we think about goals, there's not that many. We sort of think that we can probably classify these into a few different types of goals. There's not an infinite number of ones. And then this sort of depends too, and you can think about sort of more civic goals, but also individual level goals. You know, at the end of the day, they actually in some way all come back to individual level goals. You want some individual to do a behavior. If we were in the consumer space, it might be buying. If we're in an NGO space, it might be donating. If we were talking about somebody's behavior, if we're talking about smoking, it might be smoke less, drink less. In this photo, buy a more fuel-efficient vehicle or a green vehicle. It might be supporting. Sometimes the behavior we want is actually kind of a weird one, which is do nothing. We want people to go about their lives and worry about other things. I often work on genetically modified food issues, and scientists say they need support. And we say, well, what you really need isn't necessarily support. The behavior you need is for people to do other things and worry about other things. And so for us, though, that's the behaviors that ultimately communication researchers studies. These are the outcomes that we care about, but they're not the actual communication itself. But one big difference between a goal and objective in our view is that a goal, you can't communicate directly. You have to do something, you have to change something else in people to achieve the behavior, but which ultimately is the goal. And so another important thing about goals is sometimes people will tell us like, no, scientists, they don't have goals. They're happy just to increase knowledge. And we don't actually think that's true. And the reason we don't think it's true is because we've surveyed scientists about goals and objectives and tactics. And so this is data from the most recent survey we did of American Association of University Scientists, AAU scientists. Somewhere in our survey, usually we have this sort of set of questions that asks to, lately we've been having them rate, like on a 100-point scale, how important or unimportant various goals are. And ultimately, the goal that always wins, whether it's this survey or other surveys we've done this with Canadian scientists, we've done this with a whole bunch of different scientific societies. The goal that always sort of wins is scientists want policymakers and the broader culture to use science. And that use bit is key, right? That's the behavior. I mean, it's a bit vague on one hand, but they want people to use the science. Sometimes people communicate because they want young people to choose careers, sometimes funding, sometimes fulfilling a duty to society. Notice the one at the bottom, which is strengthening their own reputation. That's not really a goal in our sense, but some of the people we did the surveys with really wanted it to be on there. But I think it's important because it highlights that the things that scientists want are sort of pro-social, right? They want to make the world a better place through the science they're doing. And to do that, they want people who are making decisions to listen to them. And that was supposed to be Anthony's slide, I just realized.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And anyways, so ultimately by goals, we won't spend a ton of time on them. It's something that we're getting increasingly interested in, trying to understand why people choose some goals and not other goals. But from a strategic communicator perspective, I think often we think that maybe the goals, they're things that sort of exist they already, right? They're not about trying to get somebody to, what you're trying to do ultimately as a strategic communicator is helping a scientist, a science communicator, clarify what their goals ultimately are. There's probably a goals probably in there. If you just push them, they have something in mind that they want to achieve. And so sometimes it's helping people clarify what those goals are. Sometimes it's trying to say, like, you know, that goal, that's like a 30-year goal. Let's be realistic. Let's scale it back. What's a goal? How can we think about this in a little bit shorter term? What's the behavior right now that we care about? And that can be an important part of strategic communication, is helping people keep their goals realistic for the time and resources they have available. And then there's also this other one, which we're trying to think about more often now, which is often a lot of the communication. One of the things we also saw in the training interviews was that a lot of people think of communication as this thing that an individual scientist or an individual maybe lab does. But when you think about goals, usually those goals are shared across a whole bunch of people in a whole bunch of different groups. And so part of a good strategic communication is finding people to work with. Communication isn't an individual level thing. And if you're trying to be effective at the end of the day, if you're trying to be strategic, you want to find people to, to organize with and to work together towards some of these behavioral goals. So let's get to tactics.
Yeah, so we talked about goals. Now let's kind of work through our model and talk a little bit about tactics. And this is the real kind of granular stuff, getting dirty with the details, so to speak. We love this. This may look familiar to some of you. This is kind of the general maxim of communication science. Or part of it, I should say. We're interested in studying who says or does what to who, in what way, and through what channel. And there's a part we left out, which we'll connect back to. But this is really what we're talking about when we're interested in trying to think about what tactics we see in science communication. So whether those are discrete communication behaviors, whether it's the kind of assemblage of a message or a series of messages or a campaign, whether it's the type of tone you're trying to strike, the intensity or the type of communication style you're using, or the modalities that you're choosing to communicate in a certain context. And so, when we talk about removing jargon, this for us is a certain tactic that in a certain situation may be really important depending on what your communication goal is. It may be less important in a different context. When we talk about building stories and crafting really wonderful stories in your communication efforts, again, that's also a tactic, or we view as being a tactic. And same thing with fostering dialogue and exchange and accessibility. And so we see a lot of this within the training area. And again, for us, we view these as tactics, really important tactics. And certainly there's a lot more of them than just these. But this is some of the stuff that we the nuts and bolts stuff that we see. And in a recent survey that we did, this AAU survey that John mentioned earlier that we just did last fall, we also asked scientists about kind of their willingness to prioritize some of these different tactics that we have. And you can see overall, they appear to be open to options according to our survey. So again, we had midpoint here 4, and there's really only 3 of these where there's hesitation. Interestingly, when we see speaking in ways that help connect with audiences, we see that that's certainly very high on the prioritization scale. When we talk about getting people angry all the way down there at the bottom, or questioning the credibility of the audience, we see that those are deprioritized, right? They're not nearly as important. Also, when we ask about, trying to get your audience members to commit to, getting the scientists to commit to certain, contribute to communication at a certain level, we see a bit of hesitation there. But overall, the take-home message from this is a prioritization across a lot of these different tactics.
Sorry, just gonna keep. I was looking at the chat message there. I just have it open in another window. By it. Yeah, and so again, tactics are an area where we're thinking a lot about recently, and we think they're super important, and they should be part of every training. But again, they're not for us. They're not at the center of communication. We're going to switch in a second, but just when we think about tactics, I think the role of the strategic communicator is when you're working with a principal, a scientist, or a scientific group. I mean, there's lots of work that needs to be done in terms of helping people identify which tactics make sense, helping people implement those tactics, helping people evaluate to make sure the tactics did what we thought they did. But again, we have this word strategic here coming up over and over again. And so we have to come back to this question of what is it do we mean by strategic? And for us, the heart of being strategic is that black box in the middle. I've hidden it now. You could see it before, but we'll come back to it. That's that black box. To us, if you really want to be strategic, you need to understand what's often in this black box of communication, and our black box of objectives. And I think for us, as people who are in 2 of the biggest and best colleges of communication in the country, these are what people in our building don't study necessarily goals. They don't necessarily study tactics. Those are things that we use to study what we really care about, which is what's in that black box. And I want to say a couple things before I just these are sort of the foregrounding bits. But I want to say, first of all, when we think about what's in that black box, we also think about how that black box works. And so one of the pieces of that that's important for what we're talking about is to recognize that people who study communication tend to think of communication as what's sometimes called a dual mode processing. Cognitive processing occurs across a spectrum from sort of automatic, heuristic, system 1 processing. And of course, Danielle Kahneman's written about this most famously. Malcolm Gladwell, probably best-selling of the books, talked about blink, this really fast automatic processing. And that's a super important part of lots of maybe advertising, lots of communication activities, but it's not what we're talking about when we're going to be talking about our understanding of what counts as public engagement in particular. And so what we're thinking about when we're talking about communication in the scientific context is we think that most scientists are really actually interested in communicating at that level 2, at that system 2 type of communication. That part of the communications is deeper, slower, and that ultimately requires more cognitive processing or cognitive engagement. And so the way that we think communication works, particularly in the science space, or the way that we think scientists are willing to communicate in the science communication space, is that thinking about fostering deeper engagement of the people we're communicating with, about the science, about both science and the scientists over the long term in a sort of a cumulative mode. And ultimately, it's sort of like drips of waters. And when ultimately we think about attitudes, what we're really talking about is beliefs, right? The beliefs and the evaluation of those beliefs. That's all. The attitude is a sum of the beliefs and the evaluations of those beliefs. And that sum, they occur over time.
Right. So as we have been working, we're always trying to come up with new analogies or metaphors or whatever to help explain a certain point of view we've arrived at from our data and our thinking. And the one that we've landed on most recently is this notion of the slow food movement. So I'm going to suggest that a lot of our data often shows us that a default setting, a predominant default setting in science communication is kind of like the hot dog stand, right? Where the scientist communication is very much, I'm going to serve hot dogs. They're going to be really good. That's all I'm going to serve. They're going to be hot. They're going to come at you really fast, and you're going to move on. So think of that as kind of the deficit model that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So the hot dog in this situation it's knowledge, right? I'm going to give you knowledge in my communication. Whereas what we're thinking about here is very different, and it's the slow food movement, which some of you are probably familiar with, which is obviously a lot more effortful, a lot more intentional, considerably slower. The menu does not just consist of hot dogs. You care very much about the context of the communication. You care about after you're done eating, what that situation looked like and how, if people had a good time or not, and if they're willing to come back, etc. So the slow food movement, I think, helps kind of bring to life a little bit about what we're arguing or how we're viewing things here. And when we talk about, that's kind of the macro level analogy, if you will. But if we think of something more specific relative to these objectives that John was talking about, I mean, think of what it would look like if the only type of ice cream we could eat in the world was vanilla, right? I mean, I love vanilla ice cream, but man, that'd be really boring. Like, it's so much more exciting to have lots of different flavors of ice cream to choose from. And, if you think of it that way, that's really a very simple argument that we're making, is when it comes to these objectives, there's all different types of flavors out there. And depending on what a scientist's goal is, one or a combination of some of these objectives or some of these flavors may be more appropriate for her to achieve a certain goal than others. So rather than defaulting here to, one or more of the traditional objectives that we have listed, what we're arguing for is a broader awareness that there are all these other flavors or objectives that you can focus on when it comes to your science communication, and that in certain situations, these are going to be more effective at achieving your goals than other objectives.
And so now we're going to really dive into what we mean by objectives. And I should say, we're not going to talk a lot about the objective of changing people's emotions or affect or interest. And we're also not going to talk about framing as an objective, though they're both super important potential communication objectives. We're not going to talk about those ones today. We're going to focus in today on objectives that are associated with various types of beliefs that we think are potentially worth prioritizing in communication. And as part of this, again, and Anthony alluded to this, our sense of when we think of this idea of the deficit model that's so people like to talk about in the science communication or public engagement world, the way we understand that is an over-reliance on a single objective, right? The over-reliance on the single objective of knowledge. Whereas we're saying that, and we think the scientific communication research community has done a pretty good job at telling people that that's not a great objective. And so I was on a National Academies committee a couple years ago in 2016, where we looked at all the data and again said, like, you know what? The available research doesn't support the idea that just teaching people stuff is going to change their attitudes or behavior. And so that one objective isn't magical, is essentially what we're saying. It's not, and again, it's not that the objective of increasing people's science knowledge isn't important. I often think of it as sort of the invitation that gets you into the room. The reason that anybody wants to listen to or talk to or share with scientific community is because we have some insights, hopefully, that are useful to people. And we're always going to spend some of our time, some of our resources sharing what we've learned. And we're obligated to do that, and we should do that. And people would find it funny if we didn't do that. And so we have to do it. But again, the point is that's not sharing our knowledge, sharing our research isn't the only bit about that we can do when it comes to communication. And so one of the things that often comes up when we talk about other things that we can do through communication is people say, oh, well, if we're not just teaching people stuff, maybe we build trust. And that's true, but I think it's a little too vague to be strategic. And so when we think about building trust, we say, well, what do we mean by building trust? What are the beliefs in particular that might occur if we do the types of tactics that really help people think about science and think with scientists? What are some of the beliefs that might form? And we think it's possible to think about it at the relational level. These aren't beliefs about science, but they're beliefs about scientists. And so beliefs about scientists' warmth, benevolence, that they're pro-socially motivated. Beliefs about honesty or integrity, that scientists are good people. Beliefs about that scientists share their value. Beliefs that scientists are competent. Those are all beliefs. And the one I want to focus on, because it's the one I like the most in my research, is this idea, the belief that scientists are willing to listen, for example. And so when we take this kind of thing, we say, well, why is it important to focus on these other beliefs? Because if you don't prioritize them, if you don't focus on them, it's really hard to make sure that you affect them. And so let's imagine that, for the argument, that we were to prioritize hoping that we want people to believe that scientists, or a specific scientist, or the scientific community more broadly, is willing to listen to other people, is open to other arguments, is willing to give other people a voice. The reason that I love objective so much is if we make that a priority, I think actually the tactics become pretty straightforward. And I've done this a lot when we're doing trainings here on campus, or when we have discussions with people. And so what will happen is we'll say, like, let's prioritize that objective, just for the sake of argument. I say, well, what would that mean? And so we go back to, what do we mean by tactics? Because I've prioritized willingness to listen beliefs, then we can seriously start thinking about where should we put our tactical resources. And we think about these different categories we said. Well, what about behaviors? If I wanted to get people to believe that I'm willing to listen, what could I do? Well, I could show up early and stay late and actually talk to people when I'm there. I could make sure that if I have 60 minutes or 90 minutes, I could make sure that there's lots of time built in for discussion. That means there's less time to share my research, but because I'm prioritizing not just sharing my research, also being perceived as a good listener, then I have to leave that time. Maybe it means making it easy for people to share their views. One of my favorite meetings I ever went to was this Nuclear Regulatory Commission in a low-income, low-education part of South Carolina, and they were asking for people's views about this new plant. And not only did they have the traditional, stand at a microphone, but they said, if you don't want to do that, there's we've set up a camera in another room, and you can do that, and you can go give your feedback on the camera. And if you don't want to do that, we've also have somebody there who will transcribe whatever it is you want to say. And so the idea was they're making it very clear that they were going to find a way to make sure that they got your viewpoint. And ultimately, even just the way you set up the room. If you set up a room like a traditional classroom, that's not necessarily inviting discussion, right? And so maybe it means round tables. Maybe it means more like a different setup in the room. So but those are all behaviors that could communicate that you're willing to listen. We could also do messages. You could talk about what you've heard in the past. You could talk about what you hope to hear in the future. You could talk about what you've heard. Those would all be things that, again, that means taking time out of sharing your research to talk about what you've heard, how you're going to do it. It could mean something about your tone. It means being polite and open. It's hard to look like you're willing to listen if you're closed off and not willing to be polite. It could mean something about you have to choose a channel that allows you to hear back from people. That might mean face-to-face. That might mean something that's moderated, where the people know and can feel that somebody's listening to them. It might also just mean who you pick to do the communication. There are people in organizations that are really good at listening, and there are people who aren't, and finding those things. The key of all of this, right, though, is the idea that you've made a choice to prioritize the objective of being perceived as as willing to listen, and then you thought backwards into the tactics bit. And so then the thing we always get back to when we hear back from people is that this sounds very it doesn't sound like two-way engagement. And we're totally committed to two-way engagement, but ultimately we think two-way engagement also has effects. But also at the same time, we would also note that these are also things that that could affect the scientist, right? So somebody who's open to two-way or mutual learning, as the AAAS talks about, that means that they may be there in the context of communicating. They want to find out, does the people they're communicating with, what do they care about? Are they honest? Are they willing to listen? Do they share their values? And so the scientists, the science communicators, should also come into any communication activity thinking about them as opportunities to change their own beliefs is the key here. And Anthony, I think this one's yours.
We've gone out into the world in the last few years, and we've asked a lot, tried to collect a lot of survey data from scientists about these objectives. And when we originally identified these objectives, it feels like a really long time ago, but certainly we brainstormed together and with colleagues, and we reached out to folks in the science communication training space, try to come up with what we felt was, not a completely exhaustive list, but one that was pretty darn comprehensive. And, we've been collecting data on that ever since, right? And we see, that certainly the scientists are much more likely to prioritize these, this notion of informing, right, or of sharing information or knowledge, and also in boosting or bolstering interest and excitement, being very traditional. And some of these other objectives that John just kind of walked through, thank you, that's really good with the cursor, super helpful, are still prioritized very high, right? The midpoint here is 50, but not as high as some of the traditional ones. And if you look down all the way at the bottom, you see the one that is least prioritized is this one of kind of prioritizing going into the communication, really being focused on being an active listener. And we see this in this particular data set. We've seen it in some other data sets as well.
And so that's to say that, and so one of the reasons we really like these types of objectives is we're going to talk about two important reasons why we really think that objectives, again, are central to being strategic. One of them is that clear objectives enable, I feel like something's out of order here, but we'll just keep going on this. One of the things is that clear objectives enable evaluation. If you know that you're trying to be perceived as sincere, you might want to ask your audience, did the communicator seem sincere? If you know you're trying to look like you're willing to listen to people, you might want to ask your audience, did they seem willing to listen? And so whereas goals, like behavioral goals, those are going to change slowly over the long term. And so they may not make sense for evaluation. But in most contexts, if we're prioritizing being perceived in very specific ways, that means in the right context, we can ask people, were we perceived in the ways that we hope to be perceived? The other great thing about objectives is that they let us talk about why certain tactics make a lot of sense. So we often worry that in the context of tactics, we talk about storytelling for the sake of storytelling or dialogue for the sake of dialogue. And so in the case of public engagement, we can say, well, what does a really thoughtful thinking about objectives tell us about why dialogue-based public engagement might be really helpful? Well, first of all, if you go back to the argument that what we think is happening in really good science communication is deeper level engagement, the thing about talking to people is it kind of forces you to actually think. It's very hard to talk heuristically. You have to, if you're engaged in a conversation, if you have somebody in front of you and or in a context where you're meant to really think about something, then it sort of increases the odds that you're going to think a little bit more deeply about the subject. And so that's pretty cool. And then as you're thinking more deeply, that's how beliefs are formed. And the face-to-face context in particular has all these opportunities for developing views about relational beliefs, beliefs that people are honest, beliefs that people are caring, beliefs that people, and so there's all kinds of opportunities to develop relational beliefs. And so dialogue's really effective on that, might be really effective as a tactic to achieve relational objectives. And even further, a nice thing about dialogue is the act of taking part in conversation might show the participants that, hey, I'm efficacious. And this is I feel like we were missing some slides here on the efficacy beliefs, but one of the beliefs we care about is the degree to which you feel an audience member or somebody feels that they have the ability to do a behavior. And the act of participating in dialogue can help people feel more efficacious.
And just to extend John's point a little bit about the value of having a clear objective for your communication it helps you resist the urge to view a certain tactic as being a magic wand or a panacea for your communication, right? You see it as being a key part in a potential process to reach an objective. And so, you look at stories and you think about, well, based on what I'm trying to achieve, is focusing in on how to craft a better story really going to help me get there? And so with stories, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the hero's journey and et cetera, but they can be really great because they can increase engagement. They can prevent or kind of foreshadow, counter arguing. They can also provide like a really natural way to do some of the things that we were talking about earlier, right? That's a really natural way to kind of convey a scientist's, deep personal or professional motivations, their competencies, certain values they have that got them into science or whatnot. So it can make them essentially feel like more of a person, right? So we see a greater sense of when, where, and how, and why we'd want to use storytelling as a tactic within our science communication process. We can do the same kind of math here when we talk about jargon too, right? So we know a little bit of jargon can help us look more competent, but boy, if we go too far and there's too much jargon, we can have all sort of unintended consequences, right? And so depending again on what our objectives are, we may need to be really mindful of what some of those consequences are. We can unintentionally completely disengage our audience. I'm sure a lot of you who have focused in on getting rid of jargon know these kinds of things. People can't process it, so they disengage. You can look like a jerk. You can, certainly make the audience with whom you're communicating feel less efficacious, as John just mentioned. Like, this topic is not for me. I have no ownership. I have no voice within it. It's far too complicated and inaccessible. Normatively, you can also feel like you're not the person who's supposed to be in the room. So again, depending on what your jargon is, or I'm sorry, what your objective is, your need to deal with jargon can become more or less important. So the objectives really help you figure out if this is a particular aspect or a tactic that you really need to focus on.
Yeah, and so I'm going to go a little bit off slide here because there's two objectives that we didn't talk about that we just want to mention. So one of them was the efficacy objective, right? Particularly beliefs about efficacy. That could be beliefs about the degree to which you're able to do something, and also beliefs about the degree to which if you do something, it'll work, right? And so those are important also beliefs. In the behavior change literature, those are probably the most powerful of the beliefs, that sense that you have to communicate in a way that people feel like they can do it, and if they do it, it'll work. So in the context of smoking, that means you can quit, and if you do quit, you're going to feel better soon. Another really important belief that's in that behavior change literature is sometimes called normative beliefs. And these are beliefs about both what people I care about are doing, but also beliefs about what, it's going to flip back so we have the, so those are, here we go. So the ethics beliefs, but also normative beliefs. Beliefs about, normative beliefs would be beliefs about what I think other people are doing. That would be a descriptive norm, but also what do I think people I care about want me to do? And so in the smoking context, that would be, do I think my friends are smoking? And do I think my friends think I should quit, right? Or do I think my friends think I should smoke? And sometimes what happens, and this is often, if those of you who are on campuses, a lot of the alcohol campaigns are built around getting people to recognize that not everybody's going out and getting drunk every weekend. The hidden norm is that most people aren't drinking a ton and getting fall down drunk every weekend. But people don't see though, because they see the people on the sidewalk who are really drunk. They don't see the people in their homes who aren't drunk. And so part of a sort of a standard communication campaign now is this sort of descriptive norm campaign where universities communicate to their students. The one I was going to show you was 9 out of 10 Michigan Staters watch a basketball game and drink fewer than 3 drinks a game, kind of thing. And so they're trying to say it's not normal to get really drunk. And again, this isn't, we're not teaching somebody about the science of alcohol, the impacts of alcohol, or why alcohol is bad. We're saying, we're using a different type of belief to try to change behavior that sometimes we know can be quite effective. And the other belief that we didn't mention, which is really this sort of a standard one, a lot of the training programs, if they talk about any of these objectives beyond knowledge, it's typically the risk-benefit beliefs. So talking about why some scientific research or some finding or some behavior is gonna be good, or why a behavior might be bad if you're trying to get somebody to stop something. Sorry, so that was just a little intergenum there, but because we missed, somehow I lost a couple slides. Just gonna skip back to where we were. And so, yeah, so there's so all that to say that there's lots of different beliefs that we could communicate if we choose to. The other question that often comes up in this context, though, is, well, but you're not talking about, often communication researchers talk about cultural cognition, or we talk about context or cultural values, and we're not talking about that here. We're talking about, and so this is the serenity prayer that some of you probably know on this guy's arm, which seems tricky. But the thing about the beliefs that we're talking about, those are the things that we actually can change in people. Things like cultural cognition, cultural context, those are things that exist in the world, and we can't change them. They're things we need to take into account when we communicate, but they're not necessarily things that, that we can do very much about. And so we take them into account, but we figure out in any given context which of these beliefs are going to make them, which beliefs, changing what beliefs, what frames, what feelings, which things are going to make the most impact on the behaviors we want. And given the opportunities we have, the tactical behaviors, opportunities that we have, we try to figure out which beliefs, feelings, or frames are going to work the best given those cultural contexts. Anthony, you want to do them?
Yeah, finish that one up and then I'll take the rest.
Yeah. So what I'd like to say is you can't do everything. This is the candy shop stuff. You can't do everything. And so the way that we think about how do you figure out which belief to focus on, usually what we say is that's the role of formative research. So if it turns out you do research and you figure out, well, people already think we're super competent, well, you're not going to spend you're not going to prioritize communicating competence beliefs. If people think that you're really pro-socially motivated and care a lot, you're not going to spend a lot of time doing that. If people feel very efficacious, you're not going to focus on efficacy. And so part of it is trying to figure out the people you're communicating with, where is there an opportunity to change beliefs? Where are they low? Where are they high? Where is there an opportunity to change? And that's where, and also, not all beliefs are associated with all behaviors in any given context. And so it's figuring out in a given context with a given, and part of this, goals are audience specific. And so for a particular group, does it make sense to try to change a belief or a feeling or frame?
So our timing's pretty good here. We'll kind of finish up and hopefully have some time to engage with you all. But if you remember only 3 things from our chat today, I think these are the 3 that John and I would like you to remember. First is this notion of how we use the slow food movement to kind of describe the bigger kind of macro perspective that we spent 45 minutes talking to you all about. And this notion very much that thinking of public engagement not as a hot dog stand, but as a slow food movement, focused much more on kind of what we can do in a thoughtful way to increase the likelihood that the folks that we're engaging with are going to do so at a more kind of cognitively elaborated way. Secondly, is just that, ultimately what we're arguing about here is when it comes to science communication, let's be a little bit more scientific, let's be a little bit more thoughtful, let's slow down a little bit. And so the argument here is that to do this and be really strategic, we would argue that it requires effort, it requires time, it requires effort, expertise, and a commitment. And specifically, thinking through what are the long-term goals, what are the kind of intermediate objectives, and then from that, reverse engineering what your tactics should be in any given situation. And the last thing is, let's not rush, right? We want quick fixes. We want to have the impacts that we want to have immediately. It may be the case in this situation that, we need to slow down and be more thoughtful about how we do this together. One of the things that's come up, as I mentioned earlier, from our qualitative research with all different folks involved in this space, whether they're informal science educators, science communication trainers, people that work at science philanthropies, people that work at universities, who am I forgetting? Folks that work at societies, that there's this overwhelming urge for kind of a sense of community, an ability to talk about and arrive at best practices, cutting across all of our different silos. We see a lot of that going on, and this is a great note on which to end and kind of plug what we're doing here right now together, right? The fact that we're having this webinar, I think, is really indicative of kind of what we need to be doing more of in this particular space. And I think we have maybe one more slide for you. Right, John? Do we have one more? Are we done?
Yeah.
And we'll just do a really quick, corny plug. We just found out recently that we signed a book contract with Johns Hopkins University Press. And we're gonna put all these ideas and thoughts in a book. We've been publishing articles and giving talks and writing things in the conversation and whatnot for a long time. And we decided, well, hey, why don't we write a book about this stuff too? And so we'll be doing that. And with luck, if we're on time, it'll come out next spring, right? Is that right? Do I have my date right? Next
Yeah,
April?
April, well, we have it, well, maybe in the summer. But yeah, and again, we're still thinking all of this stuff through. Our views on this stuff has been evolving, and participating in things like this and sharing with folks like you guys is helping us sort of, think all of that through.
Yeah, well, the more feedback, the better. When we talk about those goals and objectives that we mentioned to you earlier, again, a lot of that is not just me and John sitting in our offices coming up with this stuff from our literature. It's also getting out and talking to folks in the space. And so we would welcome any thoughts or ideas that you all have.
And well, for that, I guess we'll go to discussion.
Here.
So there's a question here from Thomas Capone. I probably grabbed that. So what about synchronous versus asynchronous communications? This was live. Well, what about if this was recorded? How does synchronous versus asynchronous matter? And so again, so for us, that would be on the tactical level. That choice of channel, so in this case, and there's nice things about synchronous communication in terms of relational stuff, but there's also nice things about slower communication where you have time to think about your response. And so when we think about any of these things, we think about each of those choices has affordances, right? They have the ability to let you do some things and not other things. I think there's lots of ways to be dialogue-based and to have good relational stuff in a two-way context. I don't know, Anthony, you want to add any of that?
No, I mean, I think that's good. I mean, that we see it as a tactic, right? And again, depending on what objective you're trying to achieve, it's going to make more or less sense, or it may be part of your program. If you're really focused on trying to, boost listening, we were harping on that a little bit earlier, then this notion of prioritizing synchronous communication as a tactic would arguably be, in most cases, a better decision than that. Yeah.
So there's another question here. Can you reiterate your original stated goal from the beginning of the talk? And so our goal was we want people to turn to scientists as the smart friend they turn to when they're faced with tricky things. And you may have noted when we're talking is a lot of the objectives that we care about are these relational objectives, right? And so the smart bit is the competence objective. So we want to make sure that scientists are communicating in a way that they're perceived as super competent, right? But at the same time, we want them to be perceived as warm and caring and listening, which is the friend bit. And so one of our fears is, and some of our colleagues on some of this work, one of them is Shupe Yuan at Northern Illinois, who does wonderful work on aggressive communication, for example. And so we really worry about, if we go back to this idea as we're all in this together, we really worry about, there are members of the scientific community who are really aggressive and mean when people disagree with them. And we don't think that increases the odds that people are going to turn to scientists when they're faced with a difficult decision. They also need to believe that scientists, the efficacy bit, they also need to believe that science can help solve problems, which is the turn to scientists when in a difficult situation.
Mm-hmm. Can I mention just another kind of another topic here that just hearing you talk through that, John, reminded me is one of the things that comes up frequently when we talk about this is, I'll just put this out there. John and I are both appointed in advertising and PR programs. And, the term advertising or public relations or marketing often has really negative affect attached to it when we talk to scientists. The assumption that in some way, shape, or form, it's kind of negative persuasion or manipulation of some sort. And that's not at all what we're talking about here. We want to make that really clear. We're talking essentially, if you're uncomfortable using the term strategic communication, if you want to think about more thoughtful communication, more effortful communication, that's fine with us. That works. And certainly the notion, an assumption underlying this model that we have here is that authenticity and integrity is completely taken for granted. It's completely baked in, right? So no scientist should be, thinking in this strategic way in a way that's disingenuous. That's not at all what we're advocating for. So I think it's an important caveat or kind of disclosure just to get out there, because I'm sure a couple people are probably thinking about that a little bit.
Anthony, are you seeing the Q&As? Do you want to?
I
can read you.
Hold on one second. Let me.
I'll just read it to you, and then you can. All right.
Okay. All right.
I'm just willing. So, if we want others to listen to us, that seems at odds with others. That seems at odds to wanting to be listeners. So how do we sort of that two-way?
Okay. I guess I'm going to take it out of the science communication context completely. right? One of the reasons why I want to talk to my wife is not because I just want her to give me answers, but because I know that she's going to be an active listener, that there's going to be reciprocity and it's going to go in both ways. So for me, I view it as being, not mutually exclusive or divorced. What about you, John?
Yeah, I mean, I once gave an earlier version of this talk on Valentine's Day to some graduate students, and I put it all in the context of dating. I mean, if no one's going to listen to you if you're not willing to listen to them. And so I think I mean, that sounds almost strategic, but also part of being an open, if you really want to be perceived as being open, then you actually have to be open, right? And so it's just,
I mean, that's part of, I don't want to sound presumptuous here, but I mean, that's kind of the key deliverable of the Alda Center, right? So, be present, be accessible, be an active listener, be there in the moment for the communication. And as a result, it's going to be bidirectional.
And so, Anthony, there's a couple questions here about what do we think about misinformation and the idea that there's a lot of scientists who feel like they need to get out there and combat our fight frame, combat negative or misinformation or bad information that's out there. And also part of that is communicating with people who may not agree with us.
Mm-hmm. I'm not gonna say in a kind of a blanket statement, don't do that. What I am gonna say is the way an individual scientist should answer whether or not he or she should engage in that way would very much come back to, well, what's their key goal? If they're gonna put the time, the energy, and the effort into that they're gonna then presumably take away from somewhere like their lab, what is it that they're hoping to achieve, and how will they know if they got there? Right? I mean, it's a big ask. I think there's lots of different goals you could have for communication. That's probably a more challenging one, right? And so I think understanding clearly why you're going to go there is a big deal. I would like to think that the kind of the process that we work through still completely applies to that situation, but it's a little bit different. I would also, I'm going to just tell a quick anecdote because I think it's one that stuck with me. I think it relates, I hope. I had lunch with someone else at my university recently, a very well-known scientist in his or her particular field. And there's no way to sugarcoat this. The person was a real jerk and kind of knew it, and had very low expectations and a very low opinion of the American public. And said to me, well, what should I do? Should I communicate ever? And I said, you should never talk to anyone outside of your family or outside of your lab, because you're dangerous. He laughed and said, you're right. I found out after that lunch that I was completely wrong. And the reason was because someone who knows this individual much better said, if you put him in front of an audience of elementary school children to talk about the mystery and the magic of the scientific method, he's a complete rock star, right? So for someone like that, the argument would be, well, his goal should be to do exactly that, to interest and excite people in that particular age cohort, and to do what comes naturally and that he's really good at, and which is really authentic. I think that would be the argument for that particular individual. So anyway, that's just my anecdote.
Yeah. I think the other bit about, so how do you talk to people who disagree with you? This again goes to that context bit, is I think you're still trying to get the same sort of beliefs, right? You want people, even if they disagree with you, you want them to recognize that you're a good person. You want them to recognize that you're willing to listen to their perspectives. You want to get them to recognize that probably you do share some of their values and that you maybe do know what you're talking about. And so, and I can't see any value to being aggressive or being annoying. Part of this is thinking about a third audience, right? So there's the person you're communicating with directly. Maybe you're online and somebody said something that's really terrible and you want to go off on them. But remember, there's a whole nother group of people that might be watching that and developing their own beliefs about how scientists are and their own, they're developing their own views. They may not have made a decision yet. They might be neutral. And my fear is that by being really aggressive, by being mean, or be looking like a jerk because you're just going to fact explain them everything, it just doesn't achieve what you want to achieve. And so again, it goes back to the is your goal to get your point of view out there, or is your goal to ultimately increase the odds over time that people are going to make use of science. I worry a lot that a lot of our communication is sort of, it just sort of happens in the moment, but that's the opposite of strategic communication, right? And so just because we don't plan to have an effect, and so actually one of the things to note in this that I didn't mention is, so sometimes we have tactics, objectives, goals, but the flip side of that is behaviors, outcomes, consequences. So even if you don't mean to have an effect, depending on what you do, you could still have it could still have an outcome. It wasn't your objective, and it could still, that outcome could still have consequences, even though it wasn't your goal. And so for us, it's just thinking about, you know, if somebody, I guess part of this too is sometimes in our final thoughts, we say like, you know, there are people you're never going to change, right? And you're not going to reach those people. And so we also worry a little bit about, we think about like, well, you should focus your energy on people that make sense for your goal. Other stuff here?
I'm sorry, I'm just replying to one particular question.
Yeah, no problem. Let's see, I'm just going to skip down a little bit. How do you compel a compelling story in a scientific paper with a word limit? I don't know that we have a lot of that. So for us, that would be a tactical question. And I think there's lots of great people who know more about that. I really like the work of Randy Olson on telling great stories. I love the folks at Story Collider do wonderful work on telling stories. For us, the cool thing is that stories as a tactic, if you go back to that hero's journey bit, right? It's about, it gives you the opportunity to put the scientists and their motivation into the context. And so telling a great story is I don't know, that's human bit. How do you tell how can urgent issues in a slow food style, e.g. vaccine? That's a good question. So we're saying go slow, but I mean, we know that there are urgent things in the world. I mean, there's, first of all, I guess the principle of, first of all, do no harm. And so just because it's urgent, that doesn't mean that you have.
Yeah, well, I mean, John, I mean, I immediately think of the world of crisis communication and public relations.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you know, it's moving fast, but it's still, if it's going well and it's going to have a good outcome, it's still incorporating the key characteristics and considerations of the slow food movement, right? So you're not rushing the judgment, you're not rushing out some sort of response. I mean, if you know, to the person who asked the question, if you look at examples of, you know, whether these are corporate or otherwise, of huge public relations debacles and crises, often you'll see one reason why, if the crisis gets worse, it's because the communication and the response to the crisis felt rushed or wasn't well thought through. And so if you want to take I would say if you want to take the model that we're talking about and essentially still use it, but use it more intensively, that's what I would argue for in that situation, as opposed to doing anything that if it feels rushed, it's because it is rushed.
And you can do work, and it can go. You can make it worse if you, just because something's urgent doesn't mean you can't do something about everything at the end of the day. But you can do what you can do. There's a question here that I love about how does this process tactics bit work with this model work with minority groups? I don't know if you want to, or underrepresented groups.
I mean, I'll just say to this question, I think this is a key question that I see lots of folks in this space intensely discussing at the moment. This was another thing, certainly in the interviews that we've done with the various players in this area. This is something that we talk about with them, about diversity on a couple different levels in terms of, well, who actually works there at your organization doing the training? What's their background? You know, whether that's educational, whether that's cultural, et cetera. Tell me about the scientists who you train. What do they look like? And tell me about the people with whom you're helping your scientists to engage. What do they look like? And across those three levels, and you know, this is coming from the mouths of the trainers and the folks we talk to, it's really homogeneous, right? There is not nearly enough diversity. And I'm focusing in on the science communication training community. I mean, they're completely aware of this. And there are exceptions to this in some organizations that are doing absolutely innovative, amazing stuff that we need to watch with a really close eye and learn from. I don't know if you're familiar with Ciencio Puerto Rico, but that's a classic example here of really doing trailblazing stuff relative to this particular question. So the good news is that I would say it's a really strong blip on a radar for people in science communication. The bad news is, from where I sit, there's still a lot of work to do.
But I will say for Anthony, for our model though, the idea would be that that would count as context, right? And so it might be that if you're working with a community that, this is the formative research bit, you have to figure out, given the context of what you're trying to do, what needs to change. And so it might be, for example, in certain communities that various aspects of trust are really low. And so that means that you need to spend more time, put more priority into things that build tactics that are likely to build some of these relational beliefs. It means that you need to do more behaviors that make it behaviors that are appropriate to a particular group. It means the messages you use, the things you say need to be appropriate to that group. The tone, intensity, style needs to be appropriate to that group. The source that you use for the training or for the communication needs to be appropriate to that group. So it's both about what objectives do you prioritize, but also given the objectives you prioritize, you need to figure out what tactics for that group are going to make the most sense. And so again, it's the formative research. What's low? What's open to change? And if those are low and they're open to change, what are the tactics? You step back and say, well, what are the tactics that are going to get us there? Or what are the tactics that aren't going to get us there? What's a tactic that we know doesn't work for a certain community?
Yeah, and that's another way to approach this too, John, right, is to use process of elimination, right? To figure out, well, what, at the very least, to determine, well, what's not going to work for us given our goal. There's this I see this other question, John, I want to highlight. It looks like it's from Alan Alter. Some scientists who attend one communications training session don't know how to implement what they learned in an ongoing way. Any suggestions for them? First of all, let me just say that what you've mentioned here does not seem uncommon at all. This is something that has come out of, that we've certainly seen in our work looking at the training community, and it's been identified by them as something that they ideally want to, improve and add into their curricula, which is you come in, you practice, and then you go back out into the real world, and who's there to support your effort then? So this notion of making clear connections for the scientists they train so that they can get the ongoing support that they need to actually practice the behavior, right? To actually do the communication. So that's a broad context for what you're mentioning, to say that's really topically important. But the other thing I'm going to mention too is it is remarkable to me, especially among like grad students in STEM, how few of them realize that there are actually staff members at their university, in their college or school or department, that are on staff specifically to help the researchers with their communication issues, right, John? I mean, I think you've seen the same story at Michigan State over and over again. We have some incredibly skilled people, for example, here at UT, who that's what they're supposed to do all day, and they do a really good darn job of it. But a lot of the faculty and a lot of the students don't know they exist. There aren't enough staff people, et cetera. So I would say the first place you need to go is look to see if there are public information officers or director of communication at your specific institution. Contact them and say, hey, what kind of support do you have for me? Let's get together, let's have lunch, let's talk about it.
And often one of the things we've noticed in the training is that it's focused on the scientists. And one of the things we've argued is that there needs to be more training focused on those PIOs, but even better would be training that helps scientists work with PIOs. We're really serious about that expertise bit. There's a question here there's a comment here. Can you touch on the slow food analogy again? And we want to try doing it because, again, this is an analogy we're working on. And so we're happy to try it out again and see if it works. And so the idea, again, why we talk about slow food, it has to do with the term engagement. So when we think of the term public engagement, which is ubiquitous, sometimes people mistake that for public engagement means dialogue. We would argue that dialogue is one tactic that's really good to foster public engagement. But more generally, what we're talking about with public engagement is any type of communication that increases the odds that somebody's going to process information more deeply. That system 2 processing, that elaborated processing, central root processing, depending on the theory that you prefer to use. But the idea is that engagement, the engagement we're talking about in public engagement is cognitive engagement. And what happens when you cognitively engage is that that's when you have an opportunity to create or change your beliefs. And by beliefs, we mean these very, we don't mean beliefs in like belief in God. We mean I had a social science thing, the beliefs, I believe that this guy is competent. I believe that this guy is caring. And so those beliefs, those stable long-term beliefs only occur when you process something more centrally so that it can get sort of locked into your into your thinking. And then the thing is that those things happen slowly. That beliefs, when you express an attitude, the attitude that you're expressing are the cumulative consequence of all the beliefs that you've created over time, or particularly the ones that are most salient, the most top of mind. And so the idea of the slow food movement, again, is just the idea that beliefs form slowly over time. As communicators, we need to take charge of making sure that we're communicating content and we're doing tactics that lead to the beliefs that we think are, that we prioritize, that are our objectives. But that happens slowly over time. There's no, so one of the, practically when you look at a lot of training, one of the things we see is these training exercises that suggest that like you're gonna go into a thing, you're gonna find some shared value, and now you're gonna share your research. And that's like, you're doing this it's a very like one-off, find a shared value, talk to that shared value, and that's effective communication. And we're saying that's not really the case. Communication effects happen slowly over time as a function of getting people to engage cognitively.
And I think we're almost done, but I wanted to squeeze in one more question if we can. John, I was going back up through the questions to see what we missed, knowing that we missed some. And there's one here from Amy Ains. Recognizing that it takes time to shift behavior and that strategic focus is key, is there a particular sequence to consider when looking at relational objectives? Do some need to be achieved before you can achieve others? I guess my first global response to that is this is a fabulous question. And it gets to a question that John and I have continued to grapple with as a result of the work we've done with the trainers, is getting a better sense for the different type of training that is out there. You start to imagine, well, in what order, ideally, should a scientist, if they have the opportunity to get trained up, would it be better if they get X training first and the next training second and third, et cetera? There's a kind of a natural progression. And or is it going to be, are you going to have huge problems in the training if you do it in an order where there's conflicts, you get too much detail too soon, et cetera? One thing that we think, again, anecdotally, is that if you're going to have, this comes from the basic trust literature, if you're going to have what we would call, mutually beneficial information exchange, right? Which is where you actually listen to someone, they listen to you, and you actually are able to exchange information with one another and process it and consider it effectively. You can't do that if you don't trust the person you're talking to, right? So Susan,
that's what I would say. I would have said, if I had to guess, I don't know.
Argument all day long, right? So not to put words in her mouth, but so there's this notion that those relational objectives, in many situations are essential if you ultimately, if part of your goal does include some sort of information exchange. So if you jump right to information exchange without considering those relational goals, the likelihood of you having a good outcome is probably going to be a lot lower than it would otherwise.
I think you see that in the trust literature, also in the education literature. People don't learn from teachers they hate, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, and I think, so for me, I think it's still a bit of an empirical question, but I would bet that the relational objectives are the ones that need to be prioritized, initially at least. And then you can go from there. Then you can start building up efficacy beliefs. Then you can get to a normative beliefs.
Yeah. Oh man, I can't stop. There's another really good question.
And so people are welcome to wander off, but we're happy to stay on for a little bit of people. But people shouldn't feel bad if they wander off. We're not going to.
Yeah. Yeah, I got a boogie in 5 minutes, but let's address Tracy's question, John. It's a good one. It's totally right up our alley. Are you seeing schools offer training to undergrad and grad students on communicating science? And if so, who typically offers this training? Or is it not being offered because current staff aren't experts on this themselves? Do you want to do that one first?
No, you should do that one because you're doing...
I don't know. We both have interesting things going on at our respective institutions, right?
Yeah.
Let me I'll try to do this succinctly. My read on this is that a lot of different, I'm going to say R1 universities, just because they are turning out arguably the most, STEM researchers, are playing around with this issue, and the notion of communication has gotten important to folks and higher up the ladder at a lot of these organizations. And so they're messing around and trying to deal with this question and are essentially exploring a lot of different models for this. You can look at places like Wisconsin and see them doing one thing. You can look at Johns Michigan State. You can look here at UT, and you'll see, in some situations things look similar, and in some situations things look different. I think a huge challenge we have is try to determine which models and approaches are working really well. But I'll tell you a little bit about, like, at UT. When I started here, we had no pedagogy at emphasis or real training being offered focused on science communication. I've been here for about, I don't know, 8 years. And it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot recently, and I would attribute that to a few different things. But we now have an undergrad minor in science communication. We have an undergrad course that I teach online in science communication that's open to all UT students, and I'm now beta testing the same class for postdocs and graduate students in our College of Natural Sciences as well. The undergrad course is required for people who want the minor. The grad level course is actually at this point a non-credit course. It's actually a really fun course to teach because I have 20 to 30 students who come in there and they're believers. So they're really interested in communication, even if they don't have a lot of experience with it. So the point is that we're definitely messing around with things down here at UT. And I know a lot of my colleagues at other R1 universities are as well. I do think this notion of expertise, which you bring up, is important. So I would argue that there needs to be some form of critical mass at the institution that can help bring to fruition kind of these efforts. Sometimes it may be just one really powerful, strong individual. Sometimes it takes more than that to make them get off the ground. But I mean, John, you have stuff going on up there too.
Yeah, so I will say, so on the undergraduate level, I was just on a call yesterday where we were talking about trying to figure out a way to get a handle on the landscape, because I think we really don't know. I think there are isolated things. I know Bruce Lowenstein at Cornell was doing some undergrad type courses. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're sporadic, but I don't think they're well organized. At the graduate student level, I mean, I think, again, they're emerging, but one of the things we've seen in the last couple of years, particularly there's a wonderful group called ComSciCom out of, started out of Harvard, but now they're all over the country. There's gonna be one in Michigan in a couple months. Graduate students taking it into their own hands to design training. And that's great, it's wonderful in the sense that they're doing that. On the other side, it's a bit of a failure in the science communication community that they don't feel served, and so they're sort of having to, so they're doing a little bit of frustration, which is too bad. But yeah, I think that landscape of the training world is still very much emerging. There's some really big ones, obviously, Alda Center being among the biggest, but also Compass and AAAS. But then there's all these sort of smaller ones and more that are still emerging. And I would say we're still trying to get a handle on who's doing what. To what degree are they doing it with sort of a strategic focus versus a lot of it is very skills focused, which is great, but part of our gig is trying to figure out how to help improve that and make it more evidence-based.
Right.
We should probably end it there and let people get back to their day.
Yep, I think so. James had to depart, but he wanted us to remind you all to look out for, they're going to send you a post-webinar evaluation survey. So stay on the lookout for that and fill that out if you can. It's been a lot of fun, John, right?
Yeah, and we're easy to find. We talk to people all the time and happy to chat with folks. And yeah, so.
Yeah, so if you asked a question and we didn't get to it, follow up on email. If you have any other ideas, please contact us. We're happy to chat.
We're easy to find. All right, bye everyone.
Take care.